Welcome back to the Connected Realms podcast. This is episode 8, chapter 8, the final chapter of the book Vampires Are. This was a really quick chapter, and what I would like to do with this episode is just make a grand summary of the book and of Kaplan's successes in this field, and also some analysis pairing what we have found out from this book regarding the reality of vampires with what we know today, given my other research outside of this book. The first 7 episodes were deep dives into every single chapter, and that was in an effort to let people sort of read this book without reading this book because, as stated way in the beginning, this book is very rare, it's very expensive, it's very hard to obtain, so most people will not be able to read it. I wanted to share it by sharing the details chapter by chapter. What I'm going to do now is just summarize, hey, if you didn't have time or patience for those first 7 episodes going over each chapter in depth, here's a high level summary of the entire book. So chapter 1 went over his research methods and advancements. So this chapter summarized is Stephen Kaplan in the 1970s wanted to pursue researching the reality of vampires because in his academic work with sociology and anthropology, he kept finding references to and evidence of the reality of vampires spanning back many, many years. So he got curious and formed a vampire research center. This was officially sanctioned in the world of academia. And for about a decade, they did very hardcore on the ground research. They sent out all sorts of communications soliciting people who believed that they were vampires or they knew of vampires to call his research center and conduct in depth interviews to discuss what they know or who they are if they are supposed to be a vampire. Over time, they were able to refine their research methods, but basically, what shook out is incredibly detailed and lengthy questionnaires, phone interviews, and finally, in person interviews. They did have to create safety measures for themselves because they figured out very quickly that when they were choosing to show up to a home of someone who's claiming to be a blood eating vampire and they're by themselves, that was very risky. So, very quickly, they got a different protocol involving all sorts of safety measures. So, that's what chapter 1 was basically about. Chapter 2, they started getting actual interviews with people claiming to be vampires and making a compelling case for it. So, 2 that we met in this chapter are William and Ramona. They are separate from each other. Both invited Kaplan to sit with them in person and even observe them having physical affections with others. And the whole gist behind these people is that they had a bloodlust, and the way they got their daily need met for blood, which they only needed a few ounces or so, is they would join things like BDSM groups or fetish groups where it was commonly accepted that, hey, I have a certain kink, I want that need met, I will give you sexual activity if you give me your blood. And it was agreed upon by both parties. So nobody's going to get in trouble. Nobody's going to get hurt. It was all mutual, it was all above board. What he remarked about William and Ramona is that both appeared to be more youthful than their age, and both had amazing teeth, very white. They did not have fangs. They did not wear gothic clothing. William did sleep in a coffin. Ramona did not. And for all intents and purposes, they appeared to just be very normal people. They had normal jobs, they lived normal lives. But importantly, after their interviews with Kaplan, both got so spooked that they ghosted him entirely. They both appeared to change their phone number, leave the area, leave their jobs, and never be heard from again, and maybe even change their names. After this, Kaplan found time and time again that this was a chronic pattern. If he interviewed any of these supposed vampires in person, they would do the same exact thing. They would completely give up their identity, leave the area, and he would never hear from them again. Chapter 3 was transcripts of specific calls that they received, either to demonstrate the typical types of calls they received, whether they were funny or serious, or to highlight some of the more intriguing calls that they received. And this was anyone from someone claiming to be a vampire to people claiming they were attacked by vampires or they were trying to Stasi style, like rat out their neighbor or some secretary down the street who they thought was a vampire because maybe didn't like the way they looked. It was actually kind of amusing. All right, chapter 4 was an in depth examination of people who seem like true vampires. And from this chapter, importantly, we get different categories of vampires. So we get People who are basically just pretending to be a vampire. It's sort of real cosplay. They wear the gothic clothing. They have fake fangs, maybe. They have black dyed hair, all that. They go to the funky underground clubs. They might even have a blood fetish, but they're not serious. And this is just dress up or a phase for them. The next type of category is vampire-like people. These are people like Ramona and William who they regularly ingest blood, like a few ounces every day or most days out of the week, and they often will trade sexual favors to get willing blood donors. Very few of these people seem to be dangerous. Very few of these people seemed to be pursuing unwilling donors. And then we have what Kaplan's calling true vampires. These are some next level people. These people are in full on blood cults, which are comprised of quite dangerous people. They have no problem performing ritual sacrifice, blood sacrifice, even murder as a form of sacrifice. And these were the types of people that started coming after Kaplan for doing the work that he was doing. And they started trying to poison his family. They did poison his dog, unfortunately, and the dog died. They almost poisoned his children. He had to move and hide his new address, and they had to take all sorts of safety precautions because the people in these blood cults were very serious about not being found out about what they were doing because they were straight up, really hurting and murdering people and animals and very much breaking the law. As part of the research, eventually Kaplan's group did get involved with law enforcement. So they would report anyone if they thought they could report a crime successfully. They would also report suspected hotspots of serial killing if that's something that they suspected was going on. And they became a point of reference for police to go to say, hey, we've got like either these blood cult things going on or somebody performing violence or murder and it involves blood drinking. What do you guys know about these types of people? So they eventually helped law enforcement quite regularly, which was a good thing that shook out from this research. Okay, chapter 5 was very interesting. That's where we met Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth claimed to be a 439-year-old vampire from England. It seems like she became a vampire in England at age 17 during the reign of Henry VIII. She had been put in prison for practicing the wrong religion. She was practicing Protestantism when Catholicism was the religion du jour. In those days, every other day, the king or queen could change their mind about which version of Christianity they wanted practiced. And if you were found practicing the wrong type, you could be beheaded. So that's what happened to Elizabeth when she was 17. She also was practicing witchcraft, but that is not what she got in trouble for. She just mentioned it in her interviews. We did not get details about what that witchcraft was. Kaplan did doubt whether she was telling the truth about this because he believed that he knew what witchcraft from 1500s England looked like, and Elizabeth did not. And it was a little bit ridiculous because it's like, hey, if you didn't live there, then what do you really know? You know what your stupid books tell you. And sometimes books can be very wrong. Like history is written by the victors, and history is written with an agenda of whoever's writing the book. But that was a big rant I went on in that chapter about academia and how snobby they can be about some concepts. But anyway, I thought it was important that she said she was practicing witchcraft because I believe that that had something to do with what happened to her. So she claims that a man named Michael jumped through her prison window. He had a different name back then, but she just called him Michael for the past couple hundred years. He jumped through her window. He lit 17 candles, put her in a room for 3 days, and then eventually performed a strange blood transfusion on her. So, what he did was he drained a lot of blood from her by cutting her wrist and drinking it. Then she passed out from blood loss, I am assuming. When she came to again, she had to then ingest blood from his wrist. Presumably, the blood had sort of mixed by this point, and so she ingested blood from him, and at that point, she became a vampire. I thought that that was really interesting because I've never heard of it being depicted like that. From that point on, she says she was just different. She indicated she did not think she had a soul like humans anymore. She did not think she was a human anymore. She did not age. She did not get sick. And she was living around the world, anywhere from Europe to various places in America. At the time of the interview, she was living in Florida, but previously had spent many years living in Indiana. I thought Indiana was important for her to mention because out of all the 50 states, Indiana is the one very random state that happens to be a hotspot for dogman sightings, vampire activity, witchcraft, and sort of demon activity. If you look at all these anecdotal modern stories that are out there about people's experiences, you find very quickly that Indiana is a hotspot for something very, very strange. And so the fact that she mentioned that, I thought gave it a little bit of legitimacy. Now, dangerously, Elizabeth had to body about 1 to 2 people every single day to satiate her need for blood. She said she needed about 9 pints of blood every day, or whatever is contained in a human body. So she would hunt every night, but she would call it marking people. She would move around to do this work. And Kaplan was even able to correlate one time when she went to Nova Scotia on vacation for a week to the same exact time somebody from Nova Scotia reported a vampire attack to Kaplan. Nova Scotia is a very small random area in Canada. So it was quite strange that somebody reported being attacked by a vampire the same week that Elizabeth was there on vacation. Now, what are vampires like according to Elizabeth? She says again, they're not human. They must be turned well before age 30 or they're too old. The way she phrased turning was very intriguing to me because she called it the vicissitudes, which, if you look up the definition of that word, it does mean going from one thing to another, but also in Old Latin, it is just the turning. So it was very intriguing that she used that very kind of old, archaic word. Her language was, in general, interesting in that way. She did hand off some of her writing samples to Kaplan. It did seem like how somebody would write had they been alive in England and America for the past few centuries. I included in that episode a sample of her handwriting and of her signature. Her signature looked exactly like the signatures from 15th, 16th, 17th century England. So just incredibly fascinating, some of the little things that shook out from her interviews. Okay, so getting back to what are vampires like according to Elizabeth, they can die. She doesn't really say how, whether that's of illness or age. If you stitch together some things she said, it is implied that they will kind of get weak and wither away and die if they don't keep up with how much blood they should be drinking every day. On that note, she says that as long as they do keep up with their daily blood needs, the longer they live, the faster and the stronger they get. Whereas obviously humans, the longer we live, the weaker and the slower we get. So she was basically in her prime at age 439 years old. So, all that said, again, she says humans can't be turned into a vampire unless they're younger than 30. Otherwise, they're too old and they actually can't handle what happens to them. Their body will suffer from the transformation and die within about 5 years. So if you're over the age of 30, congratulations, you're not gonna get turned into a vampire. She also says that not everybody, so this runs very counter to the legend and lore. Not everybody who performs the activity of turning turns. And so, first of all, she discounts entirely the notion that a bite on the neck could lead to being turned into a vampire. It's not like if you have rabies and you bite someone and give them rabies with your saliva and it gets in their bloodstream and it's all over and it's guaranteed. It's not like that at all, which is what we presently think of vampirism being like. She says it's more like the act of trying to make a baby. You can perform that act many times, but it only takes once in a while, right? If at all. So it does seem like there may have to be some certain conditions met for this process that she went through to be able to successfully result in some human being turned into a vampire. She says the men cannot father children because their body temperatures are too low. And likewise, all the vampires interviewed that were deemed to be true vampires said they were childless, so it seems like both men and women were incapable of bearing children. They don't get sick or need doctors. They live solo lifestyle. So Elizabeth said she basically lived completely alone. She did have a companion in Michael for hundreds of years. But in more recent years, like the past 50 or 70 years, she said they parted ways because they were just sick of each other. They did not have a romantic relationship. It was just companionship. He also needed to spend time teaching her how to be a vampire at first, but eventually they did part ways, and she did not like spending any time with vampires. She said they're too neurotic, and she's neurotic as well. She also does not like humans. She thinks they're very stupid. She doesn't seem to have much patience for them, and she also doesn't want to be found out. So she was constantly using a fake identity. She did have an assistant who was a human who helped her with these fake identities. That assistant would help divert mail to various places before she physically got it to Elizabeth. She would register cars to Elizabeth using various fake names. She would help Elizabeth obtain various passports, especially once the person attached to that passport was actually dead. And this secretary of hers, again, human, was scheduled, it seems, to become a vampire at some point. It's like she was, I guess, what we would call the familiar of another vampire in the state of Florida that Elizabeth knew of and knew well, but she didn't want to be around this vampire, but they shared this sort of secretary human woman. She's basically a serial killer. She goes around killing, like I said, one or two people every night. She moves around to do it, and she has yet to be found out. Kaplan did try to obtain enough information to be able to report her, but was never successfully able to do so because she was ahead of him on every point and turn on that. She enjoyed speaking to Kaplan because I think it filled a loneliness void for her, and it gave her the chance to kind of talk about who she is without having the pitchforks come out, which is like the normal reaction of anybody in society. So it seems like a very lonely existence. It seems like she didn't want to choose this as her lot in life, but it had happened to her and she just sort of accepted it. One of the most interesting parts of Elizabeth's interview was when Kaplan said, "What does it feel like to drink blood? What is that process like for you?" And she said, "Well, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes. And during that whole time, my feet are cold. And then what it feels like is if you're at the height of a yawn, you get that feeling, that intensity all throughout your body. It feels like that for the entire time she's draining blood from a body. And then it cools down after she's done. So, because of that, and a couple of other things that she said or displayed, like the signature, the bit about living in Indiana, these sorts of things, it does seem like she either was the world's best anonymous fictional storyteller who did really good research and worked really hard at making her handwriting look legitimately like Old English handwriting, or there was some truth to what she was saying. Another really neat thing that Elizabeth mentioned, and I almost forgot to talk about this, was her eyes and her basic predator abilities. So she focused a lot of her conversation in the beginning on how her eyes are different. They look like crystal or broken glass as opposed to a human's eyes, which have a softer appearance. She said hers have more of like a metallic or crystalline appearance. And it appears to her that her pupils are made up of something altogether different than human eyeballs. And that if you were to stare at her long enough, you would notice that her eyes are different. She has an incredible ability to see. So it goes well beyond what humans are capable of, more like something like an eagle. She says that if you were to put a dollar bill 50 yards out, she would be able to see every little line on it. And also, when she gets hungry, like when she hasn't had blood in about 18 hours or so, she starts to get highly irritable, but also she starts to hear noises more acutely and see things with more accuracy. So it's like all her predator senses start to hone in. She's an actual predator. So again, like either she's the world's best fictional anonymous storyteller who told a story to some guy on the phone back in 1973, or there's actual legitimacy to her claims. So, really quickly, I'm just going to summarize chapters 6 and 7 because what we're going to do is wrap back around with Elizabeth mixed into more things Kaplan found out and then go into analysis of what this all means. Elizabeth was a major part of this book. So, just to get it out of the way, chapter 6 summarized was a series of quizzes asking you whether or not you were a vampire based on your answers to the questions. And then chapter 7 was a random scattering of academic theories about blood and lore and what that means about weaving vampires throughout the fabric of our culture. Some of the things that shook out from that chapter, which was essentially a brainstorming session, were things like the lore seems to be connected directly to a religious agenda to control the more violent inclinations of humans via scaring them, saying, okay, well, if you're not close to religion and you're out there being violent and killing people, you're going to turn into a vampire, which is a miserable existence. Don't do that. So, this would have been where the myth and lore of vampires being afraid of religious symbolism would have derived from. The whole sleeping in coffins thing probably derives from fears of burying people alive. The association with rabid bats is very understandable. So, over time, that would become the notion that vampires turn into bats. And again, their appearance and bloodlust could be from medical conditions such as severe anemia. Now, what are vampires like according to Kaplan and the rest of the research that he's done? So, pulling away from Elizabeth and these sort of fantastic things that she revealed, and focusing more on what are the collective vampires like that Kaplan identified throughout his research, which was about 20 to 30. And he interviewed hundreds of people. So it was a small number of people. We'll talk numbers in a minute here. But he said, in terms of their behavior, personality, and appearance, they tend to be very charismatic people with personalities that really draw you in. Think typical celebrity. They all had a youthful appearance. They appeared to be younger than their years. They were all night owls. They all preferred to operate at night, but they could operate during the day. It wasn't like the sunlight was there burning them. They do have physical withdrawals when no blood is available. So, for part of the book, Kaplan does try to equate their bloodlust with drug addiction, but that just didn't work for me because it really turns out that this small number of people actually seems to need blood as we need food and water. It's not like a crack addict thinks they need crack, but they really don't. They just want it at a chemical level. It's not like that at all with these specific people called true vampires. They have a deep need to have blood, or else things get very bad for them very quickly. And they think that they will die without it. They all have a strong need to conceal their identity. So they never give their real name to Kaplan. They're very hesitant to do in person interviews. They're very hesitant to give out even their real phone number. And then, like I said before, they will ghost Kaplan at some point as soon as they're done divulging things, and he'll never hear from them again. And importantly, none of them had children, and almost none of them were married. Two of them were partnered together for companionship, but they all said they don't have any romantic or sexual inclinations the way that humans do. Kaplan's research continued throughout the 80s and 90s. So that's what he basically is summarizing chapter 8 with. He's saying he did continue his work. After this book, he did a vampire census and he conducted additional research. And with all of that, all found, he was estimating that in America, there were 150 to 200 actual vampires. Interestingly, 40 of those lived in California, and 36 of those Californian vampires were in LA. He calls LA a hotspot for vampire activity. His supposition is that it's because, oh, there's just already people with the energy there that a vampire would feel comfortable with, you know? The types of people that live in LA, they're all kind of night owls with high energy. They're all charismatic. They're all like sexually charged and all this. To him, that's as far as it went. To me, I expound upon that and say, well, no, now in 2024, we understand that some really sinister, crazy shit goes on in LA, specifically in Hollywood. Witchcraft, occultism, Satan worship, sacrifice. I mean, we have learned a lot the past few years about how dark and sinister Hollywood is now, but has always been. If you haven't read the book Hollywood Babylon, I highly recommend that. I am reading it right now, and it's talking all about how, since its inception, Hollywood has been a place fraught with nothing but bribery, drug use, sexual assault, crime, blackmail, occultism, you name it. So my theory about why vampires are highly concentrated in LA is, well, that's where a lot of very evil, sinister things are already happening. That's where people are already summoning a lot of dark energy, right? And I don't think that vampires are anything good. I think that this is nothing but of the devil, right? And I'm not trying to sound silly with that. I'm trying to say I do believe there's a strong connection between Satan worship or demonic activity and vampirism. But wrapping up how Kaplan concluded things, he was very happy with the research that he did because, first of all, they were able to help law enforcement and maybe they were able to prevent harm and death from occurring with this work that they did alongside law enforcement. They were also able to define vampirism as someone who feels the need to drink human blood regularly and feels like they can't go without it. That's a really nice refined definition of it, and it gets rid of all the crazy noise of They turn into bats. They are afraid of garlic. They sleep in coffins. The sunlight burns them. Yada yada yada. They were able to identify certain possible medical issues which could be confused with vampirism. I thought the most convincing argument they made for this was the possibility that some people throughout history who were called vampires could have just been incredibly anemic. Because if you have a strong case of anemia, you are very pale. You're usually very tired, so you're found sleeping a lot in the daytime and maybe being more awake at night. And importantly, your blood is missing a key component. It's missing iron and it might even be missing other things. Anemics who are untreated tend to eat very strange things like ice cubes or laundry starch, which signals that, okay, my body's missing something and I think that I can get it from this other substance. I don't think that they are able to get it from that substance, but it's a funny thing that happens. Maybe in the more severe cases of anemia, especially before they knew what anemia was and how to treat it, would be, hey, my blood is missing something vital. I need blood. If you try chicken blood or pig's blood, maybe that satiates you, maybe it doesn't, but eventually you might move on to human blood because your body's telling you to get something that you're missing in your own blood. I don't think that that's too far of a stretch. Today, we might not encounter that ever happening because treating anemia is one of the most basic things in the world in this century. Importantly, Kaplan's group gained the ability to distinguish between vampire like people and true vampires. And then from there, they were able to tell us how true vampires might look and behave without, again, all that fictional noise of wearing the capes and having the fangs. None of that is the case. It turns out they seem to be just like you or me. Importantly, on that note, one of the key things that Elizabeth had mentioned very much in passing was that she was part of a race of vampires that were the human like race. She didn't mean what we think of when we say race. She wasn't like, oh, there's like black vampires and Hispanic vampires and Asian vampires. No, she meant I'm part of the vampires that look and behave like humans because I had a human appearance at the time that I was turned into a vampire. There are other vampires that look altogether different. She also said she only happened to still have female body parts because she had female body parts when she was turned into a vampire. She said, I just have these parts because they were the ones I had when I was turned. So again, it appears that you could be an octopus maybe and get turned into a vampire, and that's what you look like the rest of your life, but you are no longer truly an octopus. All of that to say, my other research has indicated that vampires might not be a monolith. They might have various forms, species, stages to them. I don't know. It seems like it could be anything from some ancient gargoyle winged monster to a sort of Nosferatu type hybrid between a monster and a human, all the way to, maybe the Twilight style, normal looking young man or woman. Perhaps those are hybridizations or different strengths of the strain of whatever this is. Now, I am going to take some time here to talk about some good shows I've seen on vampires. I do believe in soft disclosure, which is where they create books, films, TV shows, etc., to kind of indicate a truth to you that is a hard truth. And there's different opinions on why they are motivated to do this. Some say that if you are involved in any of the sort of dark arts, that one of the rules is you have to tell humans what you're up to. And if you do, it means you have their permission to just keep going on with it, right? Pretty sick, pretty psychotic if that's the way of it. But that is something I've heard that seems compelling given what kind of garbage prevails in the arts and entertainment industry now. But all that said, there are some cool shows out there. One of them I mentioned in a previous episode is What We Do in the Shadows. And this seems to have some facts backing it. It mixes a lot of silly lore with a couple of compelling possible truths. So, one of the compelling possible truths that we learned by talking to Elizabeth was that maybe this concept of a familiar is something that's true. A human who is intended to get turned into a vampire and who spends their time doing kind of like bitch work or secretary work for the vampires in the meantime. Another thing that seems true is they're not able to really reveal themselves to the humans, and they do a lot of work to keep their identities and overall existence concealed. The silly things that they do, which probably have no basis in truth, are They turn into bats and sleep in coffins and hypnotize humans quite easily. There's another show I'm watching now that's quite serious and it's creepy. Some of the acting is kind of shit, but it's called The Strain. It's available on Hulu. And it's about vampires who take over New York City. And basically, what they want to do is just let it rip and let vampirism take over the earth very quickly. So they start in New York City and they want to really just spread it. Whereas before, the agreement seemed to be contain this and do what you've got to do very secretively, living underground, minimal human casualties, etc. Well, somebody decided, nah, I just want everyone to be a vampire now. So the show displays how that works. And how it works is it's not like a vampire bites you on the neck and drinks your blood and then you're a vampire. Vampirism in this show is actually a straight up virus, and the human body is just the host. The virus spreads via worms that are crawling all throughout each host. When the host gets close enough to a human, they don't even have to take their blood for this to happen. If the worms just get inside a human, that human's going to turn into a vampire. And it happens pretty quickly within a number of days. Interestingly, their genitals fall off is one of the first things that does happen. They take on a really gross appearance, bald, pale, really ugly. Their nose falls off eventually. But the most interesting part is that the vampirism is all the human organs in the torso disappear and get replaced by this very long serpentine tongue thing with a huge stinger on it. So think of like a huge boa constrictor that leaps out of your mouth, and that is the parasite. You are just a zombie host at this point. You are not you anymore. You are gone. You are just what it uses to walk around and find blood. It leaps out of your mouth and has a stinger that locates the neck or the leg or wherever it can drain the blood quickly. And that stinger penetrates the human, and sometimes they die and then come back as a vampire, and sometimes they don't. Again, it all depends on whether the worms crawl in them or not. I find this to be very interesting because it sort of tracks a little with what Elizabeth is saying in terms of, well, you are the same kind of looking creature as you were before you got turned, but you're no longer you. You are just a way for this vampirism to keep persisting and perpetuating itself. Now, she gives us a very different reality of what somebody turning into a vampire, what that process is really like. It doesn't involve worms. It's not like a huge tongue that leaps out of you. But there were some things she said that had a basic commonality with aspects of this show, The Strain. Now, I did watch Dracula, the movie that was inspired by Bram Stoker's book. I haven't read his book yet. I did find that the movie, at least, and it could be very different from the book, is fraught with a lot of what I think now is just fluffy aspects of the lore and legend and not very much based in fact. But that ugly sort of Nosferatu type entity that he becomes and he's not his human form anymore. I do think there's legitimacy to that. I don't think that if you or I were sort of turned into a vampire today, I don't think we would ever take on that form. I think it would be more like what Elizabeth says. But I do think that there is some either original race, or I don't like to call it master race, but some ancient form that looks kind of more like that and behaves much more animalistically. On that note, I highly recommend the TV show Midnight Mass. I think that that was an excellent depiction of not only what a more animalistic vampire could be like, the very scary looking thing with wings that comes around and drains everyone of blood and wreaks havoc on a village, but it's also a testament as to what people might do when confronted with something like that. They go and dress him up in robes and put him up in the church and make everybody in the village think he's an angel. It's a very good show. Please watch it. But the importance of that show, I think, is to depict that vampires probably aren't always what you think they are in terms of beautiful humans walking around drinking blood out of your neck all politely. It might actually be a very horrifying creature that lives in caves or underground, should never come out. And if it ever did come out, it would be catastrophic for our society. After reading Kaplan's work, I feel like there were some really important things that shook out. One of them was that the danger of the work they did helped to reveal the legitimacy of the claim that vampires could be real. And look, this could just be as simple as blood cults are real and that's it. But what happened was, again, Kaplan's life was put in danger more than once. His safety was in danger pretty much all the time, as well as the whole vampire research group. So the people coming after them were quite serious about not wanting humans to know what they were up to. Also, getting ghosted by people claiming to be real vampires and having them just drop off the face of the earth seemingly added legitimacy to the notion that maybe these were real vampires. Or there's something real going on, whether that means they are truly vampiric or just hardcore members of a cult. I mean, why would hardcore members of a cult come around and do interviews? All these people seem to be doing interviews because they lacked basic companionship and understanding. That's a human thing. I mean, I know people who join cults are humans, but that's not really something a full-blown cult member is going to be feeling. Again, some of the things that Elizabeth said offered legitimacy in my mind, specifically the thing about Indiana and Nova Scotia. And something that Kaplan laments about in his last chapter is skeptics and what he came up against with that. So he was constantly faced with skeptics who, no amount of evidence was ever going to be good enough for them. And so they would immediately resort to ridiculing him, especially because he was an academic. So when you're in the world of academia, you're getting ridiculed just for going against popular narratives all the time. Like, look at Graham Hancock. If you dare to say that Egypt is older than they say it is in our high school textbooks, you will be raked over the coals and maybe your whole life will be destroyed because you dared to say something that goes against the narrative. That's just a really simple example. Kaplan was going against a huge narrative. Even somebody like me, who I'm just out here talking about paranormal stuff, talking about whether or not vampires are real is gonna get you looked at funny even by people who believe in ghosts and aliens and Bigfoot. Right? Like, I thought it was ridiculous a year ago. Now, I'm full on going to write a book about it because I'm so intrigued by what I have found out while conducting armchair research. But anyway, he laments about skeptics, and this is something that you'll always come up against when you're endeavoring to understand and explain paranormal phenomenon. You're gonna come across a ton of people who are like, "Show me evidence," and then you show them evidence and they say it's fake, right? In the world of ghosts or UFOs or Bigfoot, this is so common. People will say, "Show me a photo, show me a video." And then you do, and they say, "It's too blurry. It's fake. It's AI. It's photoshopped." And it's like, okay, well, it's never going to be enough for you until you straight up encounter the ghost or go and get anally probed by an alien. Like, I really just don't know what to tell you. I don't really even argue with skeptics. It's like nothing's going to change their mind except their own personal experience. And even then, 50% of the time, a skeptic will come up against something actually paranormal and they'll still dismiss it. So Kaplan did complain about skeptics, but he also seemed to just accept that that's always how it's going to be. Importantly, I really appreciated how Kaplan's work was able to distinguish between vampire LARPers, vampire like people, and true vampires. These three categories are really, really important. I'm an analyst for a living, so I always am trying to tell people look, it's not as simple as you're trying to make it be. If you oversimplify it, if you try to make a monolith out of something, if you try to make everything black and white, you're going to miss important details to understand the truth of the thing. That thing could be a data set or trends. That thing could be explaining Bigfoot, right? If you oversimplify it, you might really miss the mark in a way that means you missed the whole thing. And one of my favorite sayings is multiple things can be true at once. So it can be true that there are humans out there just pretending to be vampires. And it could be true that there are some people roaming around out there who truly are vampires and maybe they're not even human anymore. And it could also be true that maybe there are these crazy species living in caves or underground who are vampiric as well. And it's all maybe kind of related. It makes sense that vampires are probably real due to sheer persistence throughout our history in lore, legend, written texts. Vampires precede the Bible. So it is written about in biblical texts and other texts that are older than that Lilith was the first wife of Adam. He discarded her because he wasn't happy. And she basically turned into like a demonic succubus. And then if you look far enough into it, you can see that it is quite likely that there is a direct tie between Lilith and vampires. I'm not going to go over that right now. I'm actually going to do some written and video content on that alone. But that is a very interesting connection. And so, if vampires are being talked about since before the Bible, and we haven't stopped talking about them and warning each other about them since, then I think that there's some legitimacy to the claim that some aspects of them is real. Does it have to be what we learn about in our fairy tale versions? Absolutely not. So Kaplan's work was incredibly important because out of like the dozen things we think about vampires, the one true thing that shook out was they need to drink a lot of human blood to feel satiated. That's it. And they're highly secretive. That's kind of a secondary. Now, the jury is still out in my mind as to whether or not vampires are 100% human because of everything we just talked about. I suspect that there is a high probability demonic influence and possession is very much a part of this. I also think witchcraft has a lot to do with bringing it about. I say this because I've heard some interviews where people are claiming that they're part of these secret societies that we kind of all know exist at this point. Like, think Bohemian Grove. It's like a secret but not so secret society where they do weird ritualistic crap in order to gain and maintain power. So there are people who have been interviewed who say, yeah, I became a vampire when I performed a voluntary ritual where I summoned a specific type of demon and it attached to me. And now I behave and even sometimes kind of look way different than my normal human self. And a lot of what I want to do is go around getting blood from people and performing certain sacrifices. That's some crazy shit. And these people are unapologetic about it, lending further to the notion that maybe they are demonically possessed. I think that directly ties in with witchcraft and occultism. I think that there's a lot more of this going on than we understand. I have just accepted that this is a huge part of existence and it makes things make a lot more sense when you think, maybe people who are lacking in soul or spirit are out there trying to summon bad energies so that they can get a little something something the cheap way, right? But it's not really the cheap way. 'Cause the joke's on them. It's always a devil's bargain. They lose in the end, but they drag a bunch of people down with them. Anyway, all this to say, to me, there's a lot of evidence that people practicing witchcraft or occultism could bring about something that manifests as what we know as a vampire. So, moving on, if we look throughout history, we see very real examples of people who seem to have really existed who could be vampires. A really fascinating example is Count of Saint Germain from France. He seemed to live all over Europe for hundreds of years. People would see him on and off. He was an advisor, I believe, to King Louis the 16th. I could have the King Louis wrong, but it was King Louis the 14th or the 16th. He was a very important part of that king's life, and he seemed to be present throughout many important events in history. And everybody who met him over many, many, many years said that he never appeared older than 40. He also never appeared to eat, although he was very rich and would always host lavish parties. People made these observations time and time and time again, and eventually people started to suspect heavily that he was a vampire. Now, fast forward to the 1900s in New Orleans, we get somebody popping up named Jacques Saint Germain. And again, he doesn't appear any older than the age of 40. He seems to have incredible charisma and influence in his local society. He holds lavish parties. He is never seen eating. And importantly, he actually had to flee the town and was never seen again after it was discovered that he bit the neck of a young prostitute. She escaped. She went out into the streets screaming. She told the police about it. They showed up to conduct an interview with him, and he was gone. Again, I'm going to be doing a written and video piece on that as well, the two Saint Germains. It is believed that they are the same person, that they are a vampire, and that they have been living for a very long time. There's actually also a dude from the 1970s who claimed to also be the same Saint Germain. And he kind of looks like the paintings that exist of the other two. So, another interesting figure to look at is Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was a 15th century ruler who lived in what we now know as Romania, but was then known as Transylvania. He was the total inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, and he basically just staked a bunch of people up the butt, first and foremost, to dissuade anyone from invading his village or his kingdom, and also because he seemed to have a very real bloodlust. And he actually tortured thousands of people with this, so there was something very psychotic going on. And I dare say there could have been something very demonic going on with Mr. Vlad. Finally, another interesting character to examine is Countess Elizabeth Bathory. She was a 16th century Hungarian countess who basically killed off anywhere from, it's estimated, 300 to 600 young virgin women in her village and bathed in their blood in order to retain her youth. She actually was quite beautiful, so maybe there's something to the notion that bathing in or ingesting the blood of people helps you retain youth. I don't know that it has to be young virgins. That seems a little extreme. You know what? It all seems extreme. But anyway, she's an extreme person. But these are just a few people. We've had throughout history a lot of instances of people in positions of power going about and making a splash in the communities by either ingesting blood, bathing in it, having a bloodlust of some sort, or seeming to be totally ageless and capable of living for hundreds of years. So, my overall conclusions are this book was fantastic. It was so exciting to read. It was so exciting to see that somebody did actual hardcore research on vampires. They didn't refer to Dracula, they didn't refer to Anne Rice, they didn't talk about the movies. He got on the ground and he interviewed people who said, I am a vampire and this is what my life is like. And he documented it for us all to find out. Now, it is tragic that whoever holds the copyright is not interested in making more copies and distributing them. So it's a shame. But I hope that you are able to really enjoy my breakdown of this book chapter by chapter. I hope that you got something out of it and were able to figure out more conclusively what vampires really could be versus what is just a bunch of nonsensical lore and legend. And I hope that you enjoyed just taking an overall journey of exploring what is this all about and what does it mean for us. I will be doing more one-off videos and one-off written pieces on vampires. There are a few things that I have stumbled upon that I find quite interesting. There is, for example, a pastor who claims to have exorcised a lot of areas, such as the Bermuda Triangle, a lot of things, such as a Loch Ness Monster, and a lot of vampires. Again, lending to the idea that maybe there is some element of this that is heavily influenced by demons or occult worship. So I look forward to exploring more of this, and I look forward to writing a book about what vampires truly are versus what they are not. I hope that you have enjoyed this first few episodes of this podcast. I'm still trying to figure these things out. I'm trying to figure out how to do a full blown monologue without making it totally fucking boring. What you can look out for next is I will be reading the books of Enoch. There are multiple books, and pairing that with what I find reading Genesis from the Old Testament of the Bible and letting you know what I find out. This is all from a non Christian perspective, but just from a perspective of analyzing the literature and trying to understand what's going on. Already, it's fascinating. And I've only read like 5 pages of the Old Testament and like 10 pages of the Book of Enoch, and it's so fucking interesting. I don't know why they removed this from the minds of most Christians, but I am hoping to shed light on that. It's totally interesting. Find out how fallen angels might have something to do with demons, vampires, Bigfoot, UFOs, you name it. I'm going to have a little bit more fun with the next one, I think, because it's just been a blast to start exploring that. I will be continuing my research on vampires, and I hope that you're enjoying it. All right, thanks for listening. See you next time.